Hi, everyone. My name is Nicholas David, and I'm currently a junior studying material science engineering and applied physics. And today I will be talking about using molecular beam epitaxy and reflection high energy electron diffraction to grow and characterize 3D topological Dirac semimetal sodium bismuth. I currently work under the liquid group at CMU in the physics department with PhD candidate Dana Peirce, postdoctoral researcher Igor Pinchuk, and principal investigators Simran Singh and Jyoti Katoch. So first off, what is sodium bismuth and what's so special about this material? Well, sodium bismuth is a three-dimensional topological Dirac semimetal. This means that sodium bismuth possesses special points in momentum space connecting the conduction and valence bands, known as Dirac points. Extending outward from these points, near the first Brillouin zone, the material exhibits a linear dispersion relation in all three momentum directions. This means that the effective mass in an electron near this point tends towards zero, leading to interesting electronic properties. And finally, the fact that sodium bismuth is a semimetal means that it has both electrons and holes as charge carriers, making it lie somewhere between a metal and a semiconductor. Over here in the bottom right is a quick animation of sodium bismuth's crystal structure, which is hexagonal with this space group, with lattice constants A of about 5.448 angstroms and C of about 9.655 angstroms. And as you can see here, when it pauses, you can see this unique hexagonal structure. Over here, as you view it along its C-axis. And then on the left over here is sodium bismuth in momentum space, shown over here. And also sodium bismuth on top of aluminum oxide, which is our sapphire substrate, which we grow sodium bismuth on top of. And so anyway, why are we interested in growing and studying sodium bismuth? Well, since sodium bismuth possesses these Dirac points, it's very similar to the famous graphene in its potential electronic applications. However, sodium bismuth has some notable advantages over graphene. Being a 3D topological Dirac semimetal, sodium bismuth offers a plethora of advantages over graphene. Sodium bismuth can be grown on a larger scale, as opposed to a unit cell thick of graphene. And another advantage to sodium bismuth is its potential use as a conducting channel in a new generation of transistors based off of the science of topological insulators. And while graphene maintains a high carrier mobility of electrons, acting as a good conductor, it cannot be switched on or off or controlled. Thus, topological insulators, such as sodium bismuth, can switch between on and off positions with the application of something that's called the gate potential. So thus, combining sodium bismuth into what we're mainly interested into, which is sodium bismuth on top of chromium oxide, which is a specific heterostructure, we can hopefully observe something called the quantum anomalous Hall effect. This is essentially the quantum version of the anomalous Hall effect, where remarkably large voltage potentials are measured transverse to an electrical current and perpendicular to an applied magnetic field. By growing sodium bismuth on top of an antiferromagnet, chromium oxide, we hope to induce some sort of magnetic ordering within sodium bismuth at that interface via the magnetic proximity effect. This effect essentially allows electron spins to talk to other nearby electron spins, creating some sort of localized ordering within the material. So why is our entire system under ultra-high vacuum? Well, growing sodium bismuth isn't easy and requires these special conditions since it is air sensitive and also extremely thin. This is why every growth from start to finish needs to take place under ultra-high vacuum conditions. In ultra-high vacuum, pressures are on the order of 10 to the minus 8 to 10 to the minus 11 torr. Just to put that in perspective, the atmospheric pressure, which we live and breathe in, is around 760 torr. So this is several orders of magnitude lower than what we're used to. Under these conditions, contaminants such as water, oxygen, nitrogen, etc., cease to exist, allowing us to grow ultra-thin materials on the order of a few unit cells. This wouldn't be feasible without such clean conditions. You may be thinking, oh, this is easy. We can just throw a few vacuum pumps in there and then we'll get to ultra-high vacuum. Well, it's not that easy. Our lab employs various techniques that are very famous in order to get to these low pressures. And to monitor our ultra-high vacuum system, we use something that's called a residual gas analyzer, which gives us real-time feedback of the gases present within our system. This information is useful for when a growth goes bad and when we're trying to diagnose what might have gone wrong. And a sample scan from this RGA is shown over here. And this RGA scan was taken during what's called a bakeout. A bakeout is essentially what we do when we suspect a portion of our system might be dirty in some way. And essentially what we do is we wrap that portion of the system in tinfoil to lock in that radiation heating, and we turn up to temperatures around 130 degrees Celsius, and that allows these contaminants to then leave the system. And as you can see here, before the bakeout, a lot of these contaminants are high in pressure and highly detected, and then after the bakeout, they all decline. And this top plot you see over here essentially looks for the specific masses that we're searching for. So for example, hydrogen sort of scans for that specific mass and goes along all the masses that we're looking for. And we input something that's called a noise floor, which is, I believe, around 31 AMU, which essentially doesn't correspond to any actual gases that are within our chamber. So if the RGA scan reads something around this 31 AMU, this noise floor, we know it's simply just noise. And so it's sort of a ground level to base everything else off of. So how do we actually grow sodium bismuth? Well, we grow sodium bismuth using a method called molecular beam epitaxy, or MBE for short. In this growth technique, various pure materials are kept in crucibles called evaporators. When it is time to grow, these materials are heated up past their melting point until they are able to evaporate and stick to our substrate. During our sodium bismuth growths, we use what's called a co-deposition, where we expose our substrate to both sodium and bismuth at the same time. The structure forms in the order of sodium, sodium, bismuth, sodium, and so on and so forth from unit cell to unit cell. However, before we're actually ready to grow, it is important to know the rate at which we're evaporating material. This is important for two main reasons. One, so we know that we are evaporating or exposing the substrates to the proper ratio of sodium and bismuth. And two, so we know how much material we're growing. Is it 1 unit cell for every minute and 30 seconds, or is it 1 unit cell every, I don't know, 30 minutes or something like that, right? And so we're able to monitor this deposition rate with something called a deposition monitor that contains a special quartz crystal. So as material is deposited onto the sensor, the natural frequency at which the crystal resonates changes as a function of mass deposited. And since this behavior is well defined, the deposition monitor is able to provide deposition rates on the order of fractions of angstroms from just very small mass changes. And so as you can see over here, this is an image of sort of the inside of the MBE chamber. We have these evaporators down here, and we have our RHEED gun, which I'll talk about briefly. And we'll also have our manipulator over here, which holds our substrate on a titanium puck. And then over here to the right is a little GIF I made of just opening and closing all the shutters in our MB chamber. And you can sort of see that some of the shutters are brighter than others, and that's mainly because those crucibles contain material that is kept at a very high temperature in its resting state. So currently, reflection high energy electron diffraction, or RHEED for short, is our main characterization technique to determine the quality of sodium bismuth that we grow. It works by shooting an electron beam with energies around 5 to 50 kilo electron volts at a low incidence angle at the sample and observing a diffraction pattern on a fluorescence screen. So you can see over here, you have your incoming electron beam at some low incidence angle, and then it being diffracted off the material and sent onto this fluorescent screen where we can look at a diffraction pattern. And over here is a somewhat similar diagram showing the inside of the electron gun, where the electrons are sent through a focusing lens and various deflection coils until it gets into our chamber, hits our sample, and then shows up again on our fluorescent screen. And RHEED gives us information about the crystallinity and surface roughness, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So RHEED operates under two main modes of diffraction. One being the elastic scattering of electrons, which is responsible for the principal diffraction peaks shown over here. And the other is through inelastic collisions responsible for the Kikuchi lines shown over here. They span a good portion of the substrate and are typically very faint. And these are typically only seen in insulators. However, they can show up in other materials. They just may not be as apparent. And so the RHEED image that we're currently looking at is a common RHEED image for our sapphire substrates before growth. If we do not see this pattern before growing, it most likely means that our substrate has been contaminated in some way. So depending on the topology of the sample surface, we will see different RHEED patterns shown on this diagram to the left. Now you can see I marked pattern or direct space B with this star over here, which is typically the section that we deal with the most. So our material that we grow, our sodium bismuth, is typically a flat surface with small domains. So it's mainly single crystal, but there are some domains in there, and it's generally very flat. And so this corresponds to a RHEED pattern shown over here on the right, which is these streaks. Now, all the way on the right over here, you can see an example of good sodium bismuth. So we see these uniform diffraction streaks that are very bright in nature. And on the right over here, we see an example of bad sodium bismuth growth, which ended up being polycrystalline. And you can see here from this growth that there's these semicircle arcs spanning where we'd normally see a very clean diffraction streak pattern. And you may have been wondering what this circular looking thing is in the bottom. And this is just a specular reflection from the RHEED gun. So shown below are a series of RHEED patterns taken from a sodium bismuth growth from start to finish. Image A shows the sapphire substrate with its three principal diffraction peaks viewed along the 1, 1, 2 bar 0 direction. And you can also see the Kikuchi lines in this image that I was talking about previously. And then moving on to image B, this is when we actually start growing sodium bismuth, and this is of 1 unit cell of sodium bismuth at 205 degrees Celsius along the same direction. And this first unit cell is often coined the seed layer, and it is the most important unit cell for growth since it acts sort of as the blueprint for the rest of the unit cells to follow. If the seed layer is bad, it is difficult to end up growing good sodium bismuth. And then moving on to image C, this is 10 unit cells of sodium bismuth at 266 degrees Celsius. And just comparing image B with image C, the 1 unit cell with the 10 unit cells, you can see that the diffraction peaks in the 10 unit cells are much brighter and a little bit more uniform. And this is due to additional constructive interference from the sequential planes of atoms that we have grown. Now I'll walk you through the process of growing sodium bismuth from start to finish. First, sapphire substrates anneal overnight for a total of 9 hours, 3 of which are spent at 1000 degrees Celsius. Then on the day of growth, the substrate is mounted onto a titanium puck using tantalum wire shown below, over here. This tantalum wire essentially ensures that the sample stays mounted to the titanium puck during the entire growth and does not move. The substrate is then loaded into the chamber and annealed at 650 degrees Celsius for 45 minutes. This annealing process is important for ensuring the cleanest possible surface before growth. During this time, bismuth and sodium are heated slowly until the deposition monitor measures rates near 1.82 angstroms per minute for bismuth and about 20 angstroms per minute for sodium. Now, before any growth can occur, after we've had measured our rates, we will then perform a calculation to determine the time needed to grow each unit cell. And then when we're finally ready to grow, we will put our substrate to around 210 degrees Celsius for the seed layer growth, which tends to grow better colder than the rest of the unit cells. And then once we start growing our remaining 9 unit cells, or however much we're growing that day, we will raise the temperature to about 250 degrees Celsius. And in between, when we grow the 1 unit cell to the rest of the unit cells, while we're waiting for that temperature to increase, we will close bismuth and keep the sample exposed to a flux of sodium atoms to make sure the sodium bismuth structure has accepted all the sodium that it can get, since sodium is in excess in this reaction, or in this growth, rather. And so then after we're done growing the remaining unit cells that we need to grow, we will then again keep the sample in a sodium flux for 10 minutes. And then in between unit cells, we will turn on RHEED quickly and take an image very quickly of the diffraction pattern. And this is because the incoming beam of electrons can interact with the growth at hand, causing the sodium bismuth structure to turn out bad in the end sometimes. On the side over here, you can see essentially all the MBE controls. And of particular interest is these Eurotherm cell controls, which controls the temperatures at which the materials sit in the crucibles in the MBE chamber. And then on the left over here is our substrate mounted to a titanium puck with this spring clip attached to it. And so the spring clip is there for when we send our samples to Berkeley, where we are able to do these measurements called angle resolved photoemission spectroscopy, which I'll talk about more soon. And essentially, the spring clip allows the sample to discharge during these measurements, making sure that the sample doesn't get too charged up at any one time. So now I'll be talking about the future research coming up. And since sodium bismuth is air sensitive, all of our characterization must take place under ultra high vacuum as well. That is why postdoc Igor Pinchuk has built an institute chamber where we can perform various transport measurements all while under ultra high vacuum. This is super cool because we can take the samples we grow in MBE and put them on what I like to call the sample highway, which is essentially ultra high vacuum cylinder that we're able to move samples across from, directly into the area in which we characterize them. And so as you can see below, these are images of material that has been sputtered. And this pattern on here that we sputtered onto the material is called a Hall bar. So this is done by placing what's called a shadow mask, which is essentially like a cookie cutter outline of this pattern you see here over the material, and then shooting charged argon particles at it, forming the pattern you see here on the material. And so using this pattern, we're able to subject the material to various electric and magnetic fields along specific directions of the sample in order to measure a response and observe a specific material property. This is how we hope to observe the quantum anomalous Hall effect I talked about previously. And as you can see over here, the pattern on the left was made on cobalt, and the pattern on the right was made on our heterostructure I talked about previously, sodium bismuth on chromium oxide. And well, you can see between these two images that we still have a little bit of work to do in getting this Hall bar looking like the Hall bar on the left. And so another mode of characterization I mentioned on the previous slide was angle resolved photo emission spectroscopy, or ARPES for short. This form of spectroscopy takes advantage of the photoelectric effect, where an incoming photon with sufficient energy knocks out an electron at the surface. Now, since sodium bismuth is an ultra-thin film, this form of spectroscopy works very well. So by probing the sample along various directions and angles, this technique can map out the electronic band structure of sodium bismuth as well as its Fermi surface. Then from these results, we will be able to evaluate sodium bismuth's electronic properties and make certain conclusions. So with both of these measurements coming up in the very near future, this is a very exciting time to be involved with research within the group. So lastly, just some acknowledgements. I'd like to thank Professor Katuch and Professor Singh for allowing me to do research within their group. And I'd also like to thank Dana Peirce and Igor Pinchuk, as well as the rest of the researchers within our group for being fantastic mentors to me this past year. And finally, a thank you to the Undergraduate Research Office and the SURF Committee for making this opportunity possible. And thanks for listening to my talk on molecular beam epitaxial growth and recharacterization of sodium bismuth. Below is my email address where you can ask me any questions you want. And over here is also a link to the Liquid Group website, which you can go check out. Thanks.